welcome to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, June 24th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the House settlement. There's some more details that have come out about different plans for how to deal with the $22 million that are going to be distributed. Ohio State's AD Gene Smith spoke on it very recently, and I want to break down his thoughts and kind of how that could be playing into the future of how this all looks. Then we'll get into Brent Venables. He signed a big-time extension and raise for the Oklahoma Sooners. Definitely a lot of interesting questions around this. Was it too early? Is 2 years not enough to know what you have? We'll get into all of it. We'll definitely break down how I feel about this decision and why I think some of that might just be a little bit overblown. But then we'll get into the June signing period. It is expected to be rejected this upcoming week. Definitely something that I was kind of in favor of, but I understand the sides of both arguments, so we'll break that down a little bit on today's show. Then we'll get into Heisman Watch. This is something we'll do throughout the week. We're going to start with the SEC and work our way through the conferences the way we've been doing the last couple of weeks with a number of different segments. And then we'll finish it off with another Monday questions, and we'll do Alabama edition this time around. Tons of questions around the Crimson Tide, and I want to break down all of them for you all. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. So definitely use that if you'd like to leave a question. Again, that's GSMCPodcast.net. But let's jump right in and let's figure out how everything is going to work in this new world that has been kind of spurred by the House settlement that went down about a month and a half ago, probably 2 months ago now, and there's been a lot of questions that have had to been answered, and very few of them have been answered up until this point, but it feels like we're starting to get a little bit better of idea of how things are going to be handled. We covered it last week where it seems like the vast majority of the money is going to be heading towards college football, college basketball, about 75% to football, 15% to men's basketball, 5% to women's basketball, with 5% to be split over the rest of the teams in that athletic department. So that was one idea that was kind of thrown out there. But then Dennis Dodd released an article on CBS that broke down a different way of approach, the Ohio State way, actually. Gene Smith, a very, very successful AD while at Ohio State, obviously did incredible things there. And he had kind of a model, I suppose, that kind of helped him get to the place that they have gotten, especially in those top-tier sports. Football being the one that takes the cake, obviously, but a number of different things. And he kind of spoke on this and how it really does kind of give you somewhat of a framework of how the future in this sport could look when it comes to this revenue distribution. And it's something that I think a lot of us saw coming in some different ways, which is kind of a stratification of these different athletic departments and deciding who is the top tier programs, who are the middle tier, who are the bottom tier, and how do you want to allocate funds to those people. And this is something that frankly happens across the country and has happened for quite some time. This is not new by any means to college football or to college sports in general. It is going to be a little bit more on the forefront going forward because there's new money coming into place, and because that money is going straight to the athletes, there's going to be more scrutiny around it. That's just kind of the way of the world, so it'll be very interesting to kind of see what happens with this. But to break down kind of what he means when he says stratification or tiering of an athletic department, basically it's kind of how it sounds. You know, you have your tier 1 sports, you have football, men's basketball, whatever third sport, is profitable for the conference or the school, which is for SEC schools, it tends to be baseball is the one that gets a little bit of money of the three. In some other ones like the Big Ten, it's a little bit more some women's basketball and some different things like that. So it kind of will vary depending on conference to conference, even school to school in some scenarios. But those top three will be fully funded. They will not have to worry about, scholarship and all of that type of stuff, NIL opportunities. That's totally handled, and they will get a large chunk of the revenue sharing agreement. So that's obviously kind of where all of this starts and where a lot of this conversation was had when they were making all of these rules going forward. they were thinking about football and men's basketball and women's basketball, the ones that, are at the forefront of college sports in a lot of ways. And then you have the tier 2 sports. You have a mix of scholarship and non-scholarship sports. They'll get partial funding, whether that looks like, some scholarships, but not all, like baseball is right now, where it's 11.7 scholarships to be given out over a 35-man roster. That's a very interesting way of going about it, and that's kind of the way that they've been going about it for quite some time, and it'll be interesting to see if this holds true within the new agreement, and if it kind of is tiered the same exact way in the new agreement, which will be really fascinating to watch, and actually something we kind of saw last week with 75% going to football, 15% going to men's basketball. That's 90% of it going to that top tier that we just talked about. And then you have the tier 3 sports. You have the non-scholarship sports, and frankly, they don't get much funding at all, to no funding. They don't get, school aid. They don't get Alston aid, which is another way that athletic departments can kind of give academic aid to some of their athletes. And then you have lower salaries for coaches. So not a lot going on there. Sometimes it's, some high-level club sports. Sometimes it's just lower-level NCAA sports that just don't have a lot of backing to them. And that's just kind of the way of things. There's always going to be a ton of sports that people want to play in college, and there's not going to be enough funding to go around for all of those sports. So there's some sports, like I know Ultimate Frisbee is a very, very popular club sport around the country. They don't necessarily get a ton of funding. They have to do a lot of fundraising. They have to do a lot of different things to get creative and get to their tournaments and things of that nature. So it'll be really interesting to see how that kind of unfolds. But this is kind of the way that the Ohio State Athletic Department, and really a lot of athletic departments, have worked, at least in some form or fashion, for quite some time. But it looks like it's going to become just a little bit more distinct going forward, which will be just fascinating to watch kind of unfold more than anything else. But obviously, Ohio State is not going to be alone in this. Everyone's going to have to figure out, how do they want to deal with women's basketball? How do they want to deal with football and all the other sports that kind of come with this? How do they want to allocate this money? And do they want to, quote unquote, do the right thing and do something out of the kindness of their heart and split it totally evenly across all the sports? Do they want to, play the business game, play the capitalism game, and go really into football and men's basketball because those are the biggest return on investment sports that you have? So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think it's one of those things where we get into these type of conversations, and a lot of the future of college sports is not going to be pretty. I'll be very blunt about that, because there's going to be hard decisions that have to be made, and that's going to cause certain kids to lose their opportunity to play, at least at a very high level in college sports. There's still going to be club sports. There's still going to be plenty of opportunities for people to play at a college level, quote unquote, but at a D1, D2, D3 level, it's going to get a little bit tougher. That's just kind of the reality of the world that we live in. And frankly, to me, I've said this probably a million times at this point, it all goes back to just the reality that the NCAA built probably, 2.5 to 3 decades ago, when all of this stuff was, being whispered about in back rooms and being talked about and being thought about. And they didn't do anything. They sat on their hands and said, well, it's not a problem right now, so we won't have to worry about it in the future. But the reality was, this was always going to happen. The players were always going to come for their money, because they've been bringing in a lot of money over the last, multiple decades, and have not seen a cent, or at least in the sense of NIL, or actually seeing the money instead of it just being a scholarship. So this is just the reality that we've kind of found ourselves in, and I frankly fully blame the people that set up a situation where you rushed yourself into NIL instead of doing it probably 25 years ago, which is what Gene Smith said they should have done, which is obviously a huge thing to be said for someone that has been in the sport as long as he has, and definitely has seen the two sides of it. This is something that could have been in place in the 90s, and NIL would have had, a certain structure about it by about the 2000s, and we'd have a better way of going about business by the 2005 maybe, and then you introduce revenue sharing about 2010 maybe, and then we have a crystalline structure on what that looks like in 2015, and then by 2024, we're not dealing with this mess all at once. We're dealing with it in sections and in steps, which is the way it should be, have been dealt with from the get-go. But this is the reality that we live in. There's going to be sports that are cut significantly in terms of funding. I hope that those sports don't officially go away. I hope that everyone gets their opportunity to play at a college level, because that's a dream that I think a lot of us have had in the past. Some of us have been able to live out, some haven't. But the reality is, we need to make sure that as many kids can do it as possible. And that will take some compromise in the terms of doing something not because it brings in the most money or not because it's the most financially sound decision, but because it's the right decision and because it does right by the kids that have given a lot of their life to swimming or to volleyball or to softball or to some of these smaller sports that absolutely deserve to play in the college level. But at the end of the day, when you are backed into a corner and you are probably a decade behind where you should be on a lot of these things, there's going to be some decisions that have to be made that probably wouldn't have had to be made had we been a little bit more out in front of this. So it's obviously, not what we want. It's a really, really frustrating thing. And hopefully there's a world where maybe you just allocate more NIL resources or more scholarships in one direction and it kind of works itself out in a way. But as of right now, it's looking relatively bleak for some of these smaller sports. And obviously college football is going to be fine because it's college football. And we never really have to worry about that. But every now and then on this show, I feel like we got to shed some light on some other college sports, because as of right now, they're kind of getting left behind. And it's a very frustrating thing to see. Hopefully that there's enough people in that room that, stand for the right thing in college sports and keep them intact. But in the meantime, enjoy all the sports you can for the schools that you can, because there's a real chance that it changes very quickly. And in the meantime, very much hope that the decision makers have that kindness in their heart to take a little bit less to make sure that these smaller sports can run and run effectively. So it'll be fascinating to watch. Definitely not something that I'm overly pumped about to get into over the next little bit, but at the end of it, hopefully we'll get to a place where everyone can play their sport and everyone's intact. And that's kind of the ultimate goal, but we got a ways to go to get there. So it'll be a bumpy but interesting ride nonetheless. But let's take our first break here. And when we come back, we got to talk about Brent Venables. He got a huge contract extension and raise. I want to break that down and how I have some questions about it, but I'm not necessarily as worried as some other people might be about Oklahoma doing this just after year 2. So stick with us and we'll be right back with that.